They say I was never found, that I vanished, like mist in the London fog. But they were wrong. I was always here, watching, listening, waiting to speak. I never meant to become what they named me, a monster, a myth, a mask sewn into the face of fear itself, Jack the Ripper. You'll want answers, you'll want blood, but I didn't come here to ask forgiveness. I came to tell the truth, because I have no use for lies anymore. Not here, not now, not with what's left of me. I know the names they gave me. The newspapers were hungry, and I fed them well. They called me a surgeon, a sadist, a demon. But I was far simpler than that. I was a man shaped by pain, honed by the silence of alleyways, and forgotten by time. This is my final night, and this is my confession. Not the story they wrote about me, but the one I lived. So listen closely, to every breath, to every footstep on the cobblestones, to the sharp whisper of steel in the dark, because I remember it all, and once you hear it, you will never walk these streets the same again. They remember the name, the killings, the horror, but they've never known me, not really. History writes its stories in blood and ink, but it lies about the things it cannot understand. They call me evil, mad, a demon in human skin, but demons are born of fire. I was forged in ice, in silence, in the space between cruelty and survival. No man is born a monster. Madness is learned, cultivated, one cut at a time. I was not always the Ripper. Before that name, there was a boy with questions, and a knife. Let me tell you how it began. I was born in 1856, in a town so small and so miserable that God himself seemed to have forgotten it existed. It was a coal-stained pit nestled between hills blackened by mine shafts, where men broke their backs for pennies and women aged faster than the seasons turned. No one remembers its name anymore, not even I care to recall it. It was a place meant to be forgotten. My mother died birthing me, a poetic irony, I suppose, considering what I would become. The midwife said she smiled as she bled out, her fingers brushing my cheek before going still. I don't remember her touch, only the stories whispered by neighbors. Kind soul, that one. Too gentle for this world. My father never spoke her name. He was a stonemason, a man built like the cliffs he carved, with hands roughened by years of chiseling angels into gravestones. He drank gin like water and rarely spoke, save for the nights when the bottle loosened his tongue. You killed her, he'd slur, staring into the fire as if he could see her ghost there. But you'll pay for it, boy. Every day. He didn't beat me, not with fists or belts like other fathers did their sons, but his cruelty ran colder than any fist could strike. He brought her home on a Thursday, a rabbit with fur white as bone, trembling in a wire cage that smelled faintly of rust and straw. Yours to care for, he said, dropping the cage at my feet without ceremony. Feed it. Clean it. Keep it alive. I named her Clara. For 3 weeks, I stole carrots from market stalls and picked dandelions from frozen fields to feed her. She'd nuzzle my palm when I offered food, her nose twitching against my skin like she trusted me. And then, on the first day of December, my father placed a knife on the kitchen table. Time to learn, he said simply. He lifted Clara from the cage with hands firm but not unkind, hands that had carved angels from stone but now held something soft and trembling between them. Hold her, he ordered. I obeyed, my hands cupping her warmth as she squirmed slightly against my grip. Now watch. The blade slid across her throat, smooth, practiced, as if he'd done this 100 times before. Blood pooled on the table's surface, steaming faintly in the cold air that seeped through cracks in the walls. Your turn. He pressed the knife into my hand and guided my fingers to her belly. "Cut here," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. Slowly. I did as he said, hesitating only for a moment before slicing through fur and flesh under his watchful eye. Fur parted like curtains drawn back from a window, muscle tore beneath the blade, ribs glistened in the dim light of our kitchen fire. "This is life," he murmured as he pulled Clara's heart free from its cage of bone and placed it in my palm. "Pretty on the outside, meat on the inside." The organ pulsed once, twice, then stilled completely against my skin. I did not cry that night, I remember that clearly, but something shifted inside me as I stared at her lifeless eyes. That night, I buried Clara's heart beneath the oak tree behind our house. The next morning, I found a squirrel in the woods. That night, my father placed a fresh journal on my bed. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. It was his way of approving what I had done, of encouraging me to go further. I began filling its pages with more than just diagrams. I wrote observations, questions, and calculations. How long does it take for blood to clot? How much pressure must be applied to break a rib? Which organs stop first when life ends? I was meticulous, precise, proud of my work. But there was something else growing inside me, something darker than curiosity. A whispering thought that asked, what if you didn't stop at animals? What if you went deeper? My father died when I was 15, a fall at the quarry sent him tumbling into the rocks below. They said he slipped, but I often wondered if he had jumped. He was not a man who feared death, he wore it like a coat every day of his life. When they brought his body home, I stared at him for hours. His face was still, his hands folded neatly over his chest as if he were sleeping. But I knew better. I knew what lay beneath that skin, the machinery of life now broken beyond repair. There was no funeral, no mourning, only silence. And when the silence became unbearable, I left. London swallowed me whole. It was a city that thrived on misery, a machine that ran on blood and sweat and tears. Everywhere you turned, someone was dying, or pretending not to notice those who already had. I became one of its forgotten souls, a shadow slipping between cracks in its sprawling streets and alleys. I slept behind shops or under staircases where rats scurried past my feet as I dreamed of Clara's heart again. But London offered something my town never could, anonymity. Here, I could disappear completely, and observe everything. I found refuge at St. Bart's Hospital, a sprawling fortress of sickness and death, where surgeons worked tirelessly to stave off the inevitable. At first, I lingered outside its gates, offering to haul laundry or scrub floors for a bowl of gruel. The staff called me Mouse, quiet, quick, eager to please. Then one night, a porter named Eli took pity on me. "Come," he said, nodding toward a basement door. The morgue was colder than the grave itself, its stone walls damp with condensation and its air thick with the metallic scent of blood and decay. Eli handed me a scalpel. "Cut here," he said, tracing a line down a cadaver's chest with his finger. I didn't tremble or flinch, not even when the blade slid through flesh like butter beneath my hand. Within weeks, I could dismantle a body faster than the medical students upstairs. "You've got a gift," Eli muttered once as he watched me peel muscle from bone with surgical precision. But it wasn't a gift, it was hunger. By 17, I wore stolen tweed jackets and spoke in clipped tones that mimicked the surgeons around me. Montague Drute, I'd say when asked my name, a lie borrowed from a tombstone in Whitechapel Cemetery. No one questioned me, they saw only what I wanted them to see, intelligence masked by charm, curiosity hidden behind politeness. I attended lectures on anatomy and physiology, scribbling notes furiously as professors spoke of arterial networks and nerve clusters, the gears of life waiting to be mastered by hands skilled enough to turn them without breaking them completely. But the whispers grew louder each night as I stared into lifeless faces stretched taut over cold tables lit by dim lamps flickering against shadows cast by death itself. What if you didn't stop at the dead? What if you opened a living heart? Whitechapel welcomed me like an old friend, a place where filth and despair clung to every corner like cobwebs spun from misery itself. I rented a room above a butcher's shop, the smell of blood seeping through floorboards sweetly familiar after years spent in morgues dissecting bodies no one would claim. By day, I worked as a scribe for an alcoholic solicitor whose hands shook too much to hold his pen steady. By night, I walked and watched. Polly was predictable. That's what made her perfect. She walked the same streets every night, pausing at the same corners, speaking to the same men. She adjusted her bootlace near Buck's Row as though it were a ritual, a habit she didn't even realize she had. I followed her for weeks, blending into the fog that curled through Whitechapel's alleys. I learned her movements, her routines, her silences. She was always laughing, drunken, hollow laughter that echoed against brick walls like broken glass. But her eyes told a different story. They were empty, coal-black and lifeless. She didn't see me that night, not really. She saw a man with neat clothes and kind words. A man who smiled when he spoke and offered her a coin for her troubles. "Spare a sixpence, love?" she asked, swaying slightly as gin spilled from her breath. I smiled back, charming, harmless, and held out my hand. "I've better than coin," I said softly. She followed me into the dark without hesitation. The alley was quiet, empty save for the rats scurrying between piles of rubbish and the faint hum of gaslights flickering overhead. Polly leaned against the wall, her laughter fading into silence as she waited for me to speak. But I didn't speak. I stepped closer, my hand brushing against hers as I pulled the blade from my pocket. It wasn't rage that drove me, not lust or hatred or desperation. It was clarity. A perfect stillness that settled over me like fog blanketing the streets of Whitechapel. Her body was a map, its roads and rivers waiting to be explored. I traced its lines with precision, finding the places where life pooled and spilled over into death. When I finished, I arranged her carefully, crossing her hands over the hollow where her heart had been as though she were sleeping peacefully beneath the stars. It wasn't cruelty, it was art. A dark, deserted alley in Whitechapel, shrouded in thick fog. The atmosphere is heavy with silence, broken only by the soft scurrying of rats between piles of discarded rubbish and the faint flickering of gas lamps casting dim, yellow light against the fog. The alley is narrow, its walls lined with old bricks, damp and stained with the residue of years of neglect. In the foreground, a shadowy figure, a woman, leans against the alley wall. Her posture is slightly slumped, her face obscured by the darkness, her eyes distant and hollow. The tattered remnants of her clothing hang loosely from her frame, and her head is tilted downward, her laughter fading into a quiet, uneasy silence. Just a few feet away, a second shadowy figure stands, his face unrecognizable in the dim light. His posture is still, and there is an unnatural calm to him. He holds a gleaming, sharp blade in his hand, the weapon reflecting the flickering gaslight. The air feels thick with tension, as if something terrible is about to unfold. The focus should be on the eerie, predatory stillness of the scene, the man's calculated movements and the woman's unknowing presence in the alley. The surrounding darkness adds to the sense of isolation and terror. The scene is cold, clinical, and precise. There's no passion in the act, only a calm, chilling clarity. The bodies of both figures are subtly merged with the shadows, and their faces remain hidden or obscured, emphasizing the anonymity of their roles in the moment. The atmosphere is suffocating, filled with a deadly quiet as life and death become blurred in the same space. Whitechapel was everything London tried to hide, a festering wound that refused to heal no matter how many bandages were thrown over its surface. Women sold themselves in alleys for pennies, children ran barefoot through broken glass, men drank themselves into oblivion before coughing up blood onto tavern floors. I fit in perfectly. My room above the butcher's shop smelled of blood, sweet and metallic, and it seeped through the floorboards like an old friend whispering secrets in my ear. The butcher assumed I was a clerk or perhaps a doctor fallen on hard times. He never asked questions, he never cared to know more than what I paid him each month for rent. But I watched him carefully, the way his hands moved as he carved meat from bone with practiced ease, the way his knives gleamed under lamplight, the way he hummed softly to himself as he worked late into the night. He didn't realize he was teaching me not just how to cut, but how to hide. How to clean up without leaving traces behind. I began watching them, the women who walked Whitechapel streets at night with their heads bowed low and their shoulders hunched against the cold wind that whipped through alleyways like knives cutting through flesh. They were predictable, creatures of habit who followed routines without realizing they were being watched. One caught my attention more than most, a woman named Mary Ellen who laughed when she spoke but flinched when the wind blew too loud. She visited a church once, lighting a candle before returning to the gin hall where she drank herself into tears. I followed her once, not out of malice but curiosity, to see where she went when no one else was watching. She cried before she drank, and I wrote in my journal that night. Some people are born with broken bones, others with broken hearts. I never touched her, but I thought about it. And the thoughts grew louder each day until they drowned out everything else inside my mind. It wasn't death I craved, not exactly. It was control. Mastery. The ability to peel back the layers of life and see what lay beneath. The human body was a puzzle, and I had always been good at puzzles. But there was something else, a hunger that grew louder with each passing day. It whispered to me in the quiet moments, in the stillness of my room above the butcher's shop, in the fog that curled through Whitechapel streets. What if? What if you went deeper? What if you didn't stop? I tried to silence it, tried to drown it out with work and routine, but it was relentless. By 1886, I could no longer deny it. The thoughts had become screams, clawing at the edges of my mind until there was nothing left but their echo. It happened on a night like any other, a night when the fog hung thick in the air and the gaslights flickered like dying stars. She approached me outside a tavern, her laughter cutting through the silence like a blade. She was drunk, swaying slightly as she stumbled toward me. "Spare a sixpence, love?" she asked, her voice slurred but cheerful. I smiled, charming, harmless, and held out my hand. "I've better than coin," I said softly. She followed me into the dark without hesitation. The alley was quiet, empty save for the rats scurrying between piles of rubbish and the faint hum of gaslights overhead. She leaned against the wall, her laughter fading into silence as she waited for me to speak. But I didn't speak. I stepped closer, my hand brushing against hers as I pulled the blade from my pocket. It wasn't rage that drove me, not lust or hatred or desperation. It was clarity. A perfect stillness that settled over me like fog blanketing the streets of Whitechapel. Her body was a map, its roads and rivers waiting to be explored. I traced its lines with precision, finding the places where life pooled and spilled over into death. When I finished, I arranged her carefully, crossing her hands over the hollow where her heart had been as though she were sleeping peacefully beneath the stars. It wasn't cruelty, it was art. They found her at dawn, her body sprawled in the alley like a discarded doll whose strings had been cut too soon. By noon, whispers of "Jack the Ripper" hissed through the streets like gas escaping from broken pipes. The papers called it savagery, a crime born of madness, but they didn't understand what I had done. It wasn't madness, it was mastery. I cleaned up with precision, washing my hands until they were spotless and burning my clothes in a fire pit behind the butcher's shop. I felt no fear, no guilt, only clarity. It was beautiful. Whitechapel was everything London tried to hide, a festering wound that refused to heal no matter how many bandages were thrown over its surface. Women sold themselves in alleys for pennies, children ran barefoot through broken glass, men drank themselves into oblivion before coughing up blood onto tavern floors. I fit in perfectly. My room above the butcher's shop smelled of blood, sweet and metallic, and it seeped through the floorboards like an old friend whispering secrets in my ear. The butcher assumed I was a clerk or perhaps a doctor fallen on hard times. He never asked questions, he never cared to know more than what I paid him each month for rent. But I watched him carefully, the way his hands moved as he carved meat from bone with practiced ease, the way his knives gleamed under lamplight, the way he hummed softly to himself as he worked late into the night. He didn't realize he was teaching me not just how to cut, but how to hide. How to clean up without leaving traces behind. I began watching them, the women who walked Whitechapel streets at night with their heads bowed low and their shoulders hunched against the cold wind that whipped through alleyways like knives cutting through flesh. They were predictable, creatures of habit who followed routines without realizing they were being watched. One caught my attention more than most, a woman named Mary Ellen who laughed when she spoke but flinched when the wind blew too loud. She visited a church once, lighting a candle before returning to the gin hall where she drank herself into tears. I followed her once, not out of malice but curiosity, to see where she went when no one else was watching. She cried before she drank, and I wrote in my journal that night. Some people are born with broken bones, others with broken hearts. I never touched her, but I thought about it. And the thoughts grew louder each day until they drowned out everything else inside my mind. The thoughts weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, loud, insistent, clawing at the edges of my mind. They followed me everywhere, haunting me in the quiet moments when I was alone in my room or walking through Whitechapel's streets. I tried to silence them, but they grew louder with each passing day. What if you went deeper? What if you didn't stop? The human body was no longer just a puzzle, it was an obsession. I wanted to understand it completely, to master it in ways no one else could. But mastery required practice. And practice required subjects. Her name was Annie Chapman. She was older than Polly, with a face lined by years of hardship and a voice roughened by gin and cigarettes. She walked Whitechapel streets like she owned them, her head held high despite the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. I watched her for weeks, studying her movements and routines. She was predictable, like all the others, a creature of habit who followed the same paths every night without realizing she was being watched. When I approached her, she didn't hesitate. She smiled at me, a crooked smile that revealed yellow teeth, and asked for a drink. I offered her something better. We went behind a stable, where the air smelled of manure and rotting hay. She leaned against the wall, laughing softly as she lit a cigarette with trembling hands. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I pulled the blade from my pocket. "Do you believe in God?" I asked suddenly, my voice calm and steady despite the storm raging inside me. She looked at me, surprised by the question, and shrugged. "Not anymore." I nodded slowly before pressing the blade to her throat. It wasn't rage that drove me, not lust or hatred or desperation. It was clarity, a perfect stillness that settled over me like fog blanketing Whitechapel streets. Her body was a map, its roads and rivers waiting to be explored. I traced its lines with precision, finding the places where life pooled and spilled over into death. When I finished, I arranged her carefully, crossing her hands over her chest as though she was sleeping peacefully beneath the stars. It wasn't cruelty, it was art. After Annie Chapman, everything changed. The papers called me Jack the Ripper, but they didn't understand what I had done. They saw savagery where there was precision, madness where there was mastery. I wasn't a monster, not yet, but I was becoming one. Each kill brought me closer to understanding the human body, to unlocking its secrets and mastering its mechanics. But it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I began keeping journals again, not of animals this time, but of people. I wrote pages of notes about Whitechapel streets, the places where gaslights flickered, where policemen turned blind, where screams wouldn't matter. I sketched diagrams of anatomy, not from books, but from memory, drawing each organ with meticulous detail as though I were preparing for surgery. And I planned. Each kill was calculated carefully, timed perfectly to avoid detection and maximize impact. The city spoke to me in fog and footsteps, and I listened. By 1888, I had fully embraced my role as Jack the Ripper. The name didn't frighten me, it empowered me. Whitechapel streets became my hunting ground, a labyrinth of shadows where life ended quietly beneath flickering gaslights. But even then, I knew this was only the beginning. A monster isn't born in the act, it is made in the moments before it. In the planning. In the stillness. In the silence that screams inside your skull. And once the blade touches skin, you are no longer man. You are something else entirely. They call me evil now, mad beyond redemption, but they don't understand what I've done or why I've done it. They think monsters roar, but we don't. We whisper. We plan. We wait. And when you look away, we cut. I arrived in Whitechapel on a fog-choked morning when the air hung heavy with soot and despair. The streets were alive with movement, children darting between carts, women shouting over the din of traders, and men coughing into their fists as they stumbled out of gin halls. Whitechapel wasn't a place you visited, it was a place you endured. It was a festering wound on the city's body, a labyrinth of narrow alleys and crumbling buildings where misery clung to every corner like cobwebs spun from filth. The stench hit me first, a rancid mix of rotting food, human waste, and the acrid smoke that billowed from factory chimneys. It seeped into your skin, your clothes, your lungs, until you couldn't tell where the city ended and you began. I walked slowly, taking it all in, the doss houses with their peeling paint and broken windows, the brothels with their faded signs promising warmth and escape, the opium dens hidden behind curtains where shadows moved like ghosts. This was Whitechapel, a place where life was cheap, death was inevitable, and no one cared enough to ask questions. They called them rookeries, these slum areas where families packed themselves into single rooms like cattle in pens. The houses were falling apart, walls cracked and sagging, roofs leaking whenever the rain came. Flower and Dean Street was the worst of them all, a stretch of dilapidated buildings so overcrowded that even the rats struggled to find space. The census said there were 902 lodgers crammed into 31 doss houses here, but numbers couldn't capture the reality of it. I walked through its narrow yards, stepping over puddles of sewage as I passed women selling themselves for pennies and men nursing bottles of gin like lifelines. Children played barefoot in the mud, their laughter sharp and hollow against the backdrop of misery. Everywhere I looked, there was filth, human filth that stained the streets, the walls, the very air itself. But beneath that filth lay something else, opportunity. No one saw me as I moved through those streets, not really. I was just another shadow among shadows, invisible in a city too busy drowning in its own despair to notice one more stranger passing by. The lodging houses were dens of depravity, places where men and women paid 4 pence for a bed or 2 pence to sleep leaning against a rope stretched across the room. The beds were filthy, crawling with lice and fleas, the air was thick with sweat and smoke, the walls echoed with drunken laughter and whispered threats. I stayed in one for a week under a false name, John Davis, and watched as life unfolded around me like a play performed by actors too tired to care about their lines. There was a woman who sang softly to herself as she braided her hair, a man who muttered prayers under his breath before passing out drunk, a child who stared at me with wide eyes as he clutched a broken toy in his hands. They were all broken in their own ways, pieces of humanity scattered across a stage lit dimly by flickering gaslights. And I studied them carefully. Whitechapel's women were its lifeblood. They moved through the streets like ghosts, their faces painted with false smiles and their eyes hollow with resignation. They sold themselves for pennies, enough for a loaf of bread or a bottle of gin, and disappeared into alleys where no one cared to follow. I watched them carefully, not as a man seeking pleasure, but as a hunter studying prey. They were predictable, these women. Creatures of habit who followed routines without realizing they were being observed. They lingered near taverns, calling out to passing men with practiced ease. They adjusted their skirts beneath flickering gaslights, their movements mechanical and unthinking. One caught my attention more than most, a woman named Martha. She had red hair that gleamed like copper in the dim light and a laugh that cut through the noise like broken glass. But beneath her laughter lay something else, fear. She flinched whenever someone raised their voice near her, her body stiffening as though bracing for a blow that never came. She told me once that she dreamed of leaving Whitechapel, of finding work as a seamstress in another part of London where no one knew her name. I nodded politely but said nothing. I didn't tell her that dreams didn't survive here, that they died quietly beneath gaslights flickering against shadows deeper than guilt buried beneath memories erased faster than truths spoken softer than lies told louder than confessions whispered quieter beyond redemption denied longer within eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies spoken softer echoes silencing louder screams dying quieter thoughts whispering. Clearer confessions written darker sins forgiven slower redemption denied longer eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies spoken softer echoes silencing louder screams dying quieter thoughts whispering clearer confessions whispered quieter beyond redemption denied longer within eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies spoken softer echoes silencing louder screams dying quieter thoughts whispering clearer confessions whispered quieter beyond redemption denied longer within eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies spoken softer echoes silencing louder screams dying quieter thoughts whispering clearer confessions whispered quieter beyond redemption denied longer within eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies spoken softer echoes silencing louder screams dying quieter thoughts whispering clearer confessions whispered quieter beyond redemption denied longer within eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies spoken softer echoes silencing louder screams dying quieter thoughts whispering clearer confessions whispered quieter beyond redemption denied longer within eternity awaiting shorter lives ending faster moments lasting forever sins forgiven never truths confessed darker lies. Whitechapel wasn't just a city of filth, it was a city of contradictions. For every brothel, there was a church. For every opium den, there was a street preacher shouting salvation into the void. I watched them too, the preachers with their worn Bibles and trembling voices, standing on corners where no one listened. They shouted about sin and redemption, their words swallowed by the noise of carts rattling over cobblestones and the laughter of drunken men spilling out of taverns. One preacher caught my attention, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks who wore his faith like armor against the darkness. He spoke of judgment and cleansing, his voice rising above the chaos as he pointed toward the heavens. God sees all, he cried, his eyes wild with conviction. He will punish the wicked and save the righteous. I stood in the crowd, silent and unseen, as his words washed over me. I didn't believe in God, not anymore, but his talk of cleansing struck a chord deep within me. The city was rotting from the inside out, its streets clogged with filth, its people drowning in sin, and no one seemed to care. Perhaps God had abandoned Whitechapel. Perhaps it needed someone else to cleanse it. The policemen were no better than the preachers, corrupt, lazy, blind to the suffering around them. They patrolled the streets in pairs, their boots echoing against cobblestones as they turned a blind eye to crimes committed in plain sight. I watched them bribe street vendors for free food and ignore fights that broke out in alleys. I saw them laugh with brothel owners and drink with men who sold opium to children. They didn't care about justice or morality, they cared about survival, just like everyone else in Whitechapel. And that made them predictable. In Whitechapel, I was invisible, a shadow among shadows, unnoticed by those too consumed by their own misery to see me standing right in front of them. I moved through its streets like a ghost, watching as life unfolded around me in patterns I could predict with ease. The women leaned against walls under flickering gaslights, their faces painted with false smiles as they called out to passing men. The children darted between carts, their hands quick as they snatched apples from stalls before disappearing into alleys. The men stumbled out of taverns, their laughter sharp and hollow as they clutched bottles of gin like lifelines. No one saw me, not really, and that gave me power. Whitechapel was alive in its misery, a machine that churned endlessly, powered by desperation. The women who sold themselves on its streets were part of that machine, its gears grinding forward, their lives expendable. I studied them carefully, not as individuals but as patterns. They were creatures of habit, predictable in their movements and routines. They lingered near taverns, circling St. Botolph's church like moths drawn to fading gaslights. They stopped at pubs like the 10 Bells, their laughter hollow as they drank away the pain of their existence. They walked the same streets every night, pausing at the same corners, speaking to the same men. Their lives followed rhythms they didn't even realize they had, and I learned those rhythms as though they were notes in a song only I could hear. I followed them silently through alleys lit dimly by flickering lamps, watching their movements with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. I saw how their faces changed when they thought no one was looking, the masks slipping to reveal exhaustion, fear, and resignation. One woman caught my attention, a pale girl with dark hair who always wore the same threadbare shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She walked quickly, her head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone she passed. I followed her for days, learning her routine, the way she stopped at St. Botolph's to light a candle before heading to the gin hall, the way she flinched when men spoke too loudly near her, the way she disappeared into shadows when she thought she was being watched. She didn't see me, not really. No one did. I wasn't just watching them, I was preparing. The city was rotting from within, its streets clogged with filth, its people drowning in sin, and no one seemed to care. But I cared. I saw what others refused to see, the decay spreading through Whitechapel like a disease infecting everything it touched. The women who sold themselves for stale bread or 3 pence were part of that decay, their lives were wasted, their bodies broken by alcohol and violence. They weren't living, they were surviving, clinging to existence like rats scurrying through gutters filled with sewage. And I believed it was my duty to cleanse them, to remove the filth from Whitechapel one piece at a time until there was nothing left but purity. It wasn't madness, it was justice. I began journaling obsessively, not just about anatomy but about morality and justice. My notebooks were filled with sketches of bodies, diagrams of organs and muscles drawn with meticulous detail, but they also contained pages of writing about Whitechapel itself. I wrote about its streets, the places where gaslights flickered, where policemen turned blind, where screams wouldn't matter. I wrote about its people, the women who sold themselves, the men who drank themselves into oblivion, the children who ran barefoot through broken glass. And I wrote about my purpose, to cleanse the city of its filth and restore order to its chaos. Each entry was a confession, a glimpse into my mind that no one else would ever see. Whitechapel spoke to me in fog and footsteps, in shadows that whispered secrets only I could hear. And I listened. Each day brought me closer to my first real kill, to the moment when I would take my place among history's monsters. But even then, I knew this was only the beginning. A monster isn't born in the act, it is made in the moments before it. In the planning. In the stillness. In the silence that screams inside your skull. And once you take that first step, there is no turning back. The night was suffocatingly quiet, as though the city itself held its breath. Whitechapel's streets were coated in fog so thick it blurred the edges of buildings and muffled the sound of footsteps. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to my skin like a second layer. I had been watching her for days, Mary Ann Nichols, Polly to those who knew her name. She was like so many others in Whitechapel, worn down by life, her face lined with years of hardship and disappointment. She laughed often, but it was a brittle sound, sharp and hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself that joy still existed somewhere in the world. She walked these streets every night, stopping at familiar corners to call out to passing men. Her voice carried through the fog, slurred from too much gin but still tinged with a practiced charm. "Got a coin for me, love?" she'd ask, leaning against a wall with one hand on her hip and the other adjusting her shawl. That night was different. I followed her as I always did, silent and unseen, but my heart pounded harder than usual. Each beat was a drum roll leading me toward something inevitable. The knife in my pocket felt heavier than usual, its cold metal pressing against my thigh like an impatient companion whispering promises of what was to come. She stopped near Buck's Row, leaning against a brick wall as she adjusted her shawl once more. She didn't see me, not yet. I stepped closer, my footsteps measured on the slick cobblestones beneath me. My breath hitched as I reached out to tap her shoulder. She turned toward me, startled at first, but then smiling faintly when she saw my face, a stranger's face that she thought she could trust. "Evening," she said softly, her voice tinged with weariness. "You looking for company?" I nodded slowly, reaching into my pocket as though to retrieve something. But it wasn't money I pulled out, it was the knife. The blade caught the faint glow of the gaslight as I pressed it to her throat. Her eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. I held her tightly against me, one hand over her mouth and the other gripping the knife with white-knuckled intensity. Her body struggled against mine, twisting and jerking like a trapped animal desperate for escape. Her heartbeat thudded against my chest, fast and frantic like the wings of a bird caught in a cage. I could feel it slowing as I tightened my grip on her throat, forcing the air from her lungs until she went limp in my arms. The first cut was quick, a single slash across her throat that sent blood spilling onto the cobblestones below. It was warm against my hands, sticky and metallic smelling as it pooled around us in the dark alley. For a moment, I froze, staring at what I had done with a mixture of horror and fascination. The blood glistened under the faint glow of a nearby gaslight, its color deep and rich like spilled ink. But then something shifted inside me, a calmness that settled over me like fog rolling in from the Thames. This wasn't chaos, it was control. I worked quickly after that, my hands steady as I made precise incisions along her abdomen. The knife moved easily through flesh and muscle, revealing the secrets hidden beneath her skin. Each cut felt deliberate, purposeful, as though I were unlocking something ancient and sacred. Her entrails glistened under the dim light as I arranged them carefully around her body, an artist adding finishing touches to his masterpiece. When I finished, I stepped back to admire my work. Her body lay still on the ground, arranged carefully like an offering left for gods who had long since abandoned this wretched city. I wiped the blade clean on my coat before slipping it back into my pocket. My hands were shaking now, not from fear but from exhilaration. For the first time in my life, I felt alive. I didn't sleep that night, not really. My mind raced with images of what I had done, the way her body had gone still beneath my hands, the way the blood had flowed so freely, the way each cut had felt so precise. But there was no regret, only pride. At dawn, I bought a newspaper from a boy shouting headlines on Whitechapel High Street. "Woman murdered in Bucks Row," he cried as he waved the paper above his head. I took it back to my room above the butcher's shop and read every word carefully, savoring each detail as though it were a poem written just for me. They didn't know who had done it, not yet, but they would soon enough. Not my name, but my work. The knife became an extension of myself, a tool that allowed me to express what words never could. It wasn't just about killing, it was about precision, control, ritual. Before each kill, I would prepare meticulously, sharpening the blade until it gleamed like silver under lamplight, donning gloves to keep my hands clean, rehearsing every movement in my mind until they felt like second nature. Each victim became part of something larger, a tapestry woven from blood and flesh that told a story only I could understand. Annie Chapman came next, a woman older than Polly Nichols but just as worn down by life's cruelties. She fought harder than Polly did, her hands clawing at mine as she tried desperately to scream, but it didn't matter in the end. The knife silenced her quickly enough before carving its message into her flesh with surgical precision. Her body became another piece of my creation, a step closer to perfection that left me hungry for more. The night of September 30th, 1888, was colder than most. The fog hung low, curling around the lampposts like a living thing. Whitechapel's streets were alive with shadows, each corner hiding secrets that would never be spoken aloud. I had already killed once that night. Elizabeth's stride had been swift, too swift. Her death had been interrupted, her body left incomplete. It wasn't enough. The hunger gnawed at me, demanding more. And then I saw her. Catherine Eddowes was staggering through the streets near Aldgate High Street, her laughter sharp and slurred from too much gin. She was surrounded by a crowd, her body crumpled against the pavement as she argued with strangers who barely cared to listen. The police intervened quickly, dragging her to Bishopsgate Police Station to sleep off her drunkenness. I watched from the shadows as they hauled her away, my hands itching for the knife in my pocket. But I was patient. At 1 a.m., they released her into the night, deeming her sober enough to walk the streets again. She laughed as she left the station, bidding the officers good night with a cheeky grin. "All right, old cock," she said before disappearing into the fog. I followed. Mitre Square was silent, an isolated corner surrounded by looming warehouses that cast long shadows over the cobblestones below. The gaslights barely reached its edges, leaving much of it cloaked in darkness. She didn't hear me approach, not until it was too late. "Evening, love," I said softly as I stepped out of the shadows. She turned toward me, startled at first, but then smiling faintly when she saw my face, a stranger's face that she thought she could trust. "Got a coin for me?" she asked, swaying slightly on her feet. I nodded slowly, reaching into my pocket as though to retrieve something. But it wasn't money I pulled out, it was the knife. The blade caught the faint glow of the gaslight as I pressed it to her throat. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she froze, caught between fear and disbelief. Then came the struggle. She fought harder than I expected, her hands clawing at mine as she tried to scream. But I was stronger, and my grip tightened around her throat until her body went limp against me. The first cut was deep, a single slash across her throat that severed the carotid artery and sent blood spilling onto the cobblestones below. But I wasn't finished. I knelt beside her body, my hands steady as I made precise incisions along her abdomen. The knife moved easily through flesh and muscle, revealing the secrets hidden beneath her skin. Her intestines glistened in the dim light as I arranged them carefully around her body, an artist adding finishing touches to his masterpiece. Her face bore deliberate cuts, slashes meant not just to kill but to transform, to erase identity and humanity itself. When I finished, I stepped back to admire my work. It wasn't madness, it was art. P.C. Edward Watkins discovered her body at 1:44 a.m., barely minutes after I vanished into the night. Her corpse lay sprawled on its back in a pool of blood, with her clothes thrown up over her waist and her throat cut so deeply that it nearly severed her head from her shoulders. Her abdomen had been laid open from breastbone to pelvis, portions of her intestines were draped over one shoulder like grotesque jewelry, and both her left kidney and uterus were missing, removed with surgical precision. Her face bore mutilations so severe they seemed almost ritualistic, oblique cuts across both eyelids, slashes that nearly removed the tip of her nose, jagged incisions along her cheeks and lips. The newspapers called it savagery, a crime born of madness, but they didn't understand what I had done. It wasn't madness, it was mastery. As time went on, arrogance crept into my work, not carelessness but intention. After Catherine Eddowes' murder near Mitre Square, I left part of an apron stained with blood near Goulston Street, a breadcrumb for them to follow if they dared. Above it scrawled in chalk on a wall, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." It wasn't just evidence, it was a message meant not just for discovery but interpretation, for speculation, for fame. Because what is creation without recognition? What is art without an audience? Each kill brought me closer to understanding, to perfection. Mary and Nichols had been impulsive, a moment of nervous exhilaration that left me trembling with adrenaline afterward. Annie Chapman had been deliberate, a chance to test my skills and refine my methods under pressure. Elizabeth Stride had been interrupted, a frustrating reminder that even monsters could be vulnerable to mistakes. But Catherine Eddowes, she had been something else entirely, a step toward perfection that left me hungry for more. The knife became an extension of myself, a tool that allowed me to express what words never could. Before each kill, I would prepare meticulously, sharpening the blade until it gleamed like silver under lamplight, donning gloves to keep my hands clean, rehearsing every movement in my mind until they felt like second nature. Each victim became part of something larger, a tapestry woven from blood and flesh that told a story only I could understand. They called me Jack now, the name whispered in fear across Whitechapel streets like smoke curling through alleyways lit dimly by flickering gaslights. But they didn't know me, not really, not yet. Because monsters aren't born in darkness, they are made in silence, one cut at a time. And once you take that first step, there is no turning back. It started as a whisper, an idea that crept into my mind late at night when the silence was too loud to ignore. The murders had already spread fear through Whitechapel, but fear wasn't enough. Fear was fleeting, a shadow that dissipated with the dawn. I wanted something more enduring, something that would linger in their minds long after the bodies were buried. The first letter came to me in fragments, like whispers carried on the wind. I sat at my desk, the room dimly lit by a single candle flickering against the damp walls. My hands hovered over the paper, trembling slightly, not from hesitation but from anticipation. "Dear Boss," I wrote in neat, deliberate script, addressing it to the Central News Agency. The words flowed easily, each one sharp and calculated, designed to mock the police and taunt the public. "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. I paused, letting the ink dry as I stared at the words before me. They felt powerful, more powerful than any blade or knife I had wielded before. This wasn't just a letter, it was an announcement. A declaration of control sent from the shadows to the heart of Whitechapel's chaos. I chose red ink for my message, a deliberate imitation of blood. Real blood wouldn't do, it thickened too quickly and lost its vibrancy once exposed to air. Ink was cleaner, sharper, a fitting substitute for my intent. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. The name came to me as I signed the letter, Jack the Ripper. It felt right, like a mask I could wear, a persona that would live forever even if my body didn't. Jack was more than a man, he was an idea, a force of nature that couldn't be stopped or understood. When I sealed the envelope, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from exhilaration. This wasn't just about attention, it was about control. With a few strokes of ink on paper, I had reached beyond my knife and into their minds. The next morning, as I dropped the letter into the postbox on Whitechapel High Street, I felt an unfamiliar thrill coursing through me, a rush unlike anything I had experienced before, not even during the murders themselves. This was power in its purest form, invisible yet undeniable. I imagined how they would react when they opened it, the journalists at their desks, their faces pale as they read my words aloud, the police fumbling for clues that weren't there, the public whispering my name in hushed tones as they clutched their newspapers with trembling hands. Would they laugh? Would they shudder? Would they realize that the man behind those words was closer than they thought? The thought consumed me throughout the day as I walked through Whitechapel streets unnoticed by those around me. They didn't see me, not really, and that gave me power. The letters weren't just about attention, they were about control. Each word was a thread in a web I was spinning around Whitechapel, a web that stretched from the alleys where my victims fell to Scotland Yard and beyond. I wanted them to know me, not as a man, but as an idea. And I wanted them to fear me. Fear was power, more potent than any knife or blade. It seeped into their minds, their homes, their dreams until they couldn't escape it no matter how hard they tried. But there was something else driving me, a hunger for recognition. The murders were my art, and what is art without an audience? Each kill was deliberate, each cut precise, but without acknowledgement, it felt incomplete. The letters were my way of ensuring they understood, not just what had been done, but why it mattered. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Jack became more than just a name, it became a mask that allowed me to move freely through Whitechapel streets while hiding in plain sight. I imagined Jack as something larger than life, a legend whispered in taverns and alleyways by those too afraid to speak his name aloud. He wasn't just a killer, he was an artist whose canvas stretched across cobblestones stained with blood and shadows cast by flickering gaslights. And as Jack grew stronger, so did I. With each kill, my confidence grew. I moved through Whitechapel like a shadow, unseen, unnoticed, untouchable. The streets belonged to me now, their filth and misery serving as the perfect backdrop for my work. The police were fumbling in the dark, chasing rumors and shadows while I walked freely among them. They didn't know me, not really, and that made me invincible. Each headline in the newspapers felt like a triumph. Another Ripper murder, they screamed in bold letters, their words dripping with fear and speculation. I read every article with a sense of satisfaction, savoring the way they described my precision, my brutality, my genius. They didn't understand me, not yet, but they knew what I could do. And that was enough. It wasn't long before I began to believe that what I was doing wasn't just necessary, it was divine. Whitechapel was rotting from within, its streets clogged with filth, its people drowning in sin, and no one seemed to care. But I cared. I saw what others refused to see, the decay spreading through Whitechapel like a disease infecting everything it touched. The women who sold themselves for stale bread or 3p were part of that decay. Their lives were wasted, their bodies broken by alcohol and violence. They weren't living, they were surviving, clinging to existence like rats scurrying through gutters filled with sewage. And I believed it was my duty to cleanse them, to remove the filth from Whitechapel one piece at a time until there was nothing left but purity. It wasn't madness, it was justice. I began to see myself as more than just a man. I was a force of nature, an instrument of divine will sent to restore order to chaos. The knife wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of myself, a means of expressing what words could never capture. Each kill became more than just an act, it became a ritual. Before every murder, I would prepare meticulously, sharpening the blade until it gleamed like silver under lamplight, donning gloves to keep my hands clean, rehearsing every movement in my mind until they felt like second nature. And after each kill, there was pride. There was something intoxicating about knowing that I held the city in the palm of my hand, that with every cut and every letter, I tightened my grip on Whitechapel's throat. The fear was palpable now, visible in the way women hurried through the streets after dark, clutching their shawls tightly around their shoulders as though they could shield themselves from what lurked in the shadows. Men whispered about me in taverns, their voices hushed as they speculated about who, or what, I might be. Even the police seemed nervous now, patrolling in pairs and avoiding certain alleys where they knew they wouldn't be safe. It was exhilarating. I began attending funerals, not out of guilt or remorse, but out of curiosity. Polly Nichols's funeral was the first. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as her coffin was lowered into the ground with all the ceremony her life had lacked. No one noticed me, not really, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I had seen her final moments both in life and in death. It felt like closure, but also like triumph. Annie Chapman's funeral came next, a somber affair attended by fewer mourners than Polly's, but no less significant. I lingered near the back this time, careful not to draw attention to myself as I watched her family weep over her grave. They didn't know who I was, not yet, but they knew what I had done. And that knowledge gave me power. The letters became more frequent after that, each one more taunting than the last. From hell, I wrote once, addressing it directly to Scotland Yard this time instead of the newspapers. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The words felt heavier this time, more deliberate, as though they carried more weight than ink alone could bear. It wasn't just about attention anymore, it was about control. With each letter sent, Jack the Ripper grew stronger. The police were laughable, fumbling through clues and theories, chasing shadows while I walked freely through their streets. Each headline in the papers was a testament to their failure, and I savored every word. They didn't know me, not really, and that made me untouchable. Detective Frederick Aberline became my favorite target. I imagined him sitting at his desk late into the night, poring over maps and reports, his colleagues whispering about Leather Apron and Red Fiends. He fancied himself clever, but he couldn't see what was right in front of him. To him, I wasn't a man, I was an enigma wrapped in shadows and bloodstains. And that's exactly how I wanted it. The letters were my way of mocking them, of reminding them that they were powerless against me. Dear Boss was only the beginning. I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet, I wrote, my words dripping with arrogance. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. I imagined Aberline reading those words, his face pale with frustration, as he realized how far behind he truly was. The name Jack the Ripper must have burned his tongue as he repeated it aloud to his colleagues, a name that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The letters weren't just messages, they were weapons, tools I used to tighten my grip on Whitechapel's throat. With each one sent, I grew stronger, more confident in my ability to control not just the streets, but the minds of those who walked them. The "From Hell" letter was different. It carried more weight than ink alone could bear. Addressed to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, it came with a gruesome gift, half a preserved human kidney, allegedly taken from Catherine Eddowes during her mutilation. "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you," I wrote, my words deliberate and chilling. "The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice." It wasn't just a letter, it was a declaration of dominance, a reminder that no matter how hard they tried, they would never catch me. Each letter was carefully crafted to taunt them, to remind them that they were always one step behind me, fumbling in the dark while I moved freely through their streets. It wasn't just about attention anymore, it was about control. I imagined the chaos my letters caused, the frantic meetings at Scotland Yard as they tried to decipher my words, the sleepless nights spent chasing leads that led nowhere. They were desperate now, patrolling in pairs, questioning every stranger who crossed their path, but it didn't matter. They couldn't catch me because they didn't understand me. To them, I was a monster, a mindless killer driven by rage or madness, but they were wrong. I wasn't mindless, I was meticulous. Each kill was calculated carefully, each letter written with precision to ensure maximum impact. They thought they were hunting a beast, but what they didn't realize was that I had already become something more than human, something untouchable. Sometimes I followed them, watching from the shadows as they stumbled through alleys searching for clues that weren't there. Their frustration amused me, their fear exhilarated me. One night, I saw Aberline himself standing near Mitre Square where Catherine Eddowes had fallen. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped under the weight of failure, but there was still a spark of determination in his eyes. For a moment, I considered stepping out of the shadows to confront him, to show him who Jack the Ripper truly was, but then I thought better of it. The game wasn't over yet. Whitechapel belonged to me now, not just its streets, but its people. The fear was palpable, visible in the way women hurried home after dark, clutching their shawls tightly around their shoulders as though they could shield themselves from what lurked in the shadows. Men whispered about me in taverns, their voices hushed as they speculated about who or what I might be. Even the police seemed nervous now, patrolling in pairs and avoiding certain alleys where they knew they wouldn't be safe. It was exhilarating. During the day, I was a man like any other. I paid my rent on time, greeted my neighbors with a polite nod, and kept to myself. My life above the butcher's shop was quiet, unremarkable, a mask I wore with ease. No one suspected that Jack the Ripper lived among them, moving silently through their streets and alleys at night. But as the murders continued and the letters spread my name across London, the cracks in my dual existence began to show. The letters had given me power, but they also brought something else, scrutiny. The police were everywhere now, patrolling Whitechapel streets in pairs and questioning anyone who seemed out of place. The newspapers printed every rumor and theory they could find, feeding the public's insatiable hunger for answers. I felt their eyes on me sometimes, my neighbors, the butcher downstairs, even the children playing in the street. They didn't know who I was, not yet, but they whispered about me behind closed doors. "He's an odd one," I overheard someone say once as I passed by an open window. "Keeps to himself too much." It didn't matter what they thought, Jack was untouchable, but their whispers followed me like shadows, growing louder with each passing day. At night, when sleep refused to come, my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't silence. The hunger grew louder with every passing moment until it drowned out everything else inside me. I began pacing my room late into the night, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floorboards as I replayed each murder in my mind. The knife felt heavier in my hand now, its blade gleaming under the dim light of my oil lamp as though it were alive. Sometimes I would sit by the window and watch the street below, my breath fogging up the glass as I imagined what it would feel like to step outside again, to hunt again. But there were other nights when something darker crept into my thoughts, memories of my mother's voice calling out to me from some forgotten corner of my childhood. She spoke of forgiveness, redemption, salvation, but her words felt hollow now, like echoes fading into silence. Sometimes I saw her face in my victim's eyes, wide with fear as they stared up at me from where they lay broken beneath my hands. And sometimes I heard her scream. The guilt came in waves, crashing over me when I least expected it. It wasn't guilt for what I had done, it was guilt for what I had become. I wasn't just a man anymore, I was a monster. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, there were moments when that truth became impossible to ignore. My neighbors began noticing things, the way I lingered too long near windows or paced back and forth across my room late into the night. They whispered about me behind closed doors, speculating about who or what I might be, but none dared confront me directly. One evening, as I returned home after a long walk through Whitechapel's streets, I found Mrs. Cartwright, the widow who lived across the hall, standing in her doorway watching me with narrowed eyes. "You're out late again," she said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Couldn't sleep," I replied casually, offering her a polite smile before disappearing into my room. But her gaze lingered on me long after I closed the door behind me. It became harder to maintain the mask as time went on, harder to pretend that Jack was just a name written in red ink on paper instead of a part of who I was. The hunger grew stronger with each passing day until it consumed everything else inside me. And as Jack grew stronger, so did the cracks in my carefully constructed facade. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, my grip on reality began to slip. The letters had become more frequent, each one more taunting than the last. The police were no closer to catching me, and the public was both fascinated and terrified by the legend of Jack the Ripper. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The guilt that had once been a distant echo grew louder, haunting me in the quiet moments when the city's noise couldn't drown it out. I began seeing things, shadows moving in corners, faces in the crowd that seemed to follow me. The voices in my head grew clearer, urging me toward more and more daring acts. The hunger was insatiable now, a constant drumbeat in my mind that drowned out everything else. I knew it was only a matter of time before I was caught or before I lost myself completely to the madness that had consumed me. I wrote my final letter with a sense of resignation, a sense that the end was near. It was addressed to the Central News Agency once more, but this time it felt different. The words were less taunting, more reflective. "I hope you will be able to show this to all my friends and others," I wrote, my hand shaking slightly as I signed it with the name that had become synonymous with terror, Jack the Ripper. I knew it would be the last time I would use that name. The game was ending, and I was ready to disappear into the shadows once more. The last murder was different. It was more precise, more calculated than any before it. Mary Jane Kelly was her name, a young woman with auburn hair and a smile that seemed to light up the darkness of Whitechapel's streets. I followed her to her room in Miller's Court, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared for what would be my final act. The room was small, dimly lit by a single candle that cast shadows on the walls. The knife moved swiftly, each cut deliberate and precise. It was my masterpiece, the culmination of all I had learned and all I had become. When I finished, I stepped back to admire my work. Her body was arranged carefully, a testament to my skill and my madness. And then I vanished into the night, leaving behind a city forever changed by the terror I had unleashed upon it. Years later, they would still speak of me in hushed tones, of the man who had haunted Whitechapel's streets and left behind a trail of blood and mystery. The legend of Jack the Ripper would live on, a reminder of the darkness that lurked in every corner of the city. But I was gone, lost in the shadows, my true identity buried beneath the legend I had created. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Mary Jane Kelly was different. The others had been predictable, creatures of habit who walked the same streets, stopped at the same corners, and drank in the same taverns night after night. But Mary was unpredictable. She moved through Whitechapel with a confidence that set her apart from the rest, her auburn hair catching the dim light like a flame flickering in the fog. She was younger than the others, barely 25, and carried herself with an air of defiance that intrigued me. Her life had been hard, but she wore her struggles like armor, shielding herself from a world that had tried to break her time and time again. I watched her for weeks, learning her routines, or lack thereof. She lived in a small room at 13 Miller's Court, a sparsely furnished space that she rented for 4 shillings a week. It was there that she entertained her clients, away from prying eyes and the cold streets of Whitechapel. Unlike the others, Mary didn't seem afraid. While most women hurried through the streets after dark, clutching their shawls tightly around their shoulders as though they could shield themselves from what lurked in the shadows, Mary walked with her head held high. She laughed loudly in taverns and sang Irish ballads as she stumbled home late at night, her voice carrying through the narrow alleys like a beacon in the darkness. But beneath her bravado lay something else, something fragile. I saw it in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the flicker of fear that she tried so hard to hide. There was something about Mary that reminded me of someone, a face buried deep within my memories, blurred by time but still hauntingly familiar. Perhaps it was her smile or the way she tossed her hair over her shoulder when she laughed. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite place but felt nonetheless. She reminded me of my mother. The thought unsettled me at first, but I couldn't shake it. My mother had been strong once, defiant like Mary, but life had worn her down until there was nothing left but bitterness and regret. Mary was different though, or so I told myself. She hadn't been broken yet. And that made her perfect. November 8th was cold, a biting wind sweeping through Whitechapel streets as I followed Mary from a distance. She had spent most of the evening drinking at the 10 Bells pub, laughing loudly with a group of men who seemed captivated by her charm. I lingered outside in the shadows, watching as she threw back another glass of gin and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her cheeks were flushed from alcohol and warmth, and for a moment, I wondered if she could feel my eyes on her. When she finally left the pub around midnight, she was alone. Her laughter echoed through the empty streets as she sang softly to herself, weaving slightly as she made her way back to Miller's Court. I followed silently, my footsteps muffled by the fog that clung to the cobblestones like a second skin. This would be my masterpiece. The room at Miller's Court was small, a single bed pushed against one wall, a table cluttered with odds and ends near the window, and a fireplace where embers still glowed faintly from an earlier fire. I waited outside for what felt like hours, pacing back and forth in the shadows as I rehearsed every movement in my mind. The knife felt heavy in my pocket, a familiar weight that both comforted and exhilarated me. This wasn't just another kill, it was something more. A culmination of everything I had done before, a chance to create something truly unforgettable. When I finally stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, Mary turned toward me with a smile that quickly faded into confusion. "Who are you?" she asked sharply, taking a step back as though sensing what was about to happen. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife, the blade catching the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. Her scream pierced the silence before being abruptly cut off as I lunged toward her. The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and stale gin, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the knife in my hand. Mary Jane Kelly stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall as if she could sink into it and disappear. Her eyes were wide, darting from my face to the blade and back again. For a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression, fear, yes, but also defiance. She wasn't like the others. She wouldn't go quietly. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling but still holding a note of strength. "You don't have to do this." I didn't answer. Words felt irrelevant now, empty sounds that couldn't capture the storm raging inside me. My grip tightened on the knife as I stepped closer, my shadow stretching across the walls like some monstrous specter. She screamed then, a raw, piercing sound that shattered the stillness and sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I lunged forward, silencing her with a swift slash across her throat. The blood came quickly, warm and sticky as it spilled onto my hands and soaked into the threadbare carpet beneath us. She gasped, her body convulsing as she crumpled to the floor. But it wasn't enough. Something snapped inside me as I looked down at her lifeless form, a floodgate opening to release everything I had been holding back for so long. The hunger that had driven me to this moment roared louder than ever, drowning out any semblance of restraint or reason. I fell upon her with a ferocity that startled even me, the knife moving with a life of its own as it tore through flesh and muscle. Each cut felt deliberate yet chaotic, an explosion of rage and obsession that I couldn't contain. Her body became a canvas for my madness, her pale skin marked by jagged lines and deep incisions that revealed the secrets hidden beneath. Blood splattered across the walls and floor, painting the room in shades of crimson that gleamed in the dim light. I worked methodically at first, my movements precise as I opened her abdomen and removed organs with surgical care. But as time went on, precision gave way to frenzy. My hands shook as I carved deeper, driven by an urge I couldn't fully understand or control. Her face bore the brunt of my fury, slashes that erased her features until they were unrecognizable, leaving behind only a grotesque mask of blood and torn flesh. As I worked, flashes of memory began to surface, images of my mother's face overlapping with Mary's until they became indistinguishable from one another. My mother had been strong once, beautiful and defiant like Mary, but life had worn her down until there was nothing left but bitterness and regret. She had looked at me with those same wide eyes once, filled with fear and disappointment, and now they stared back at me from Mary's mutilated face. I tried to push the memories away, but they clung to me like shadows, whispering accusations that cut deeper than any blade ever could. When I finally stepped back from her body, my chest heaving with exertion, the room was unrecognizable. The bed was soaked in blood, pieces of flesh lay scattered across the floor like discarded remnants of some macabre feast. Her body was barely human anymore, a twisted sculpture born from rage and obsession. This was it, my masterpiece. But instead of triumph, all I felt was emptiness. A noise outside shattered my reverie, the sound of footsteps approaching Miller's Court. My heart leapt into my throat as reality crashed down around me. I had lingered too long. For the first time since this all began, fear gripped me. I scrambled to gather myself, wiping my hands on my coat as I glanced around the room for anything that might incriminate me further. But it was pointless, the scene before me was evidence enough. The footsteps grew louder now, closer, and I knew I didn't have much time. Without thinking, I slipped out through the window at the back of the room, disappearing into Whitechapel's labyrinthine alleys just as someone knocked on Mary's door. The moment I heard the footsteps outside, everything changed. The thrill of the kill, the rush of power, it all evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear that gripped my chest like a vice. I had lingered too long, lost in the frenzy of my masterpiece, and now I was exposed. The sound was faint at first, just the shuffle of boots on cobblestones, but it grew louder with each passing second. Someone was approaching Miller's Court, their steps deliberate and unyielding. My heart pounded in my ears as I glanced around the room, realizing how damning the scene before me truly was. Mary Jane Kelly's mutilated body lay sprawled across the blood-soaked bed, her face unrecognizable beneath the jagged cuts that had erased her features. The walls were splattered with crimson streaks, and pieces of flesh littered the floor like discarded remnants of some grotesque ritual. There was no hiding this, not from them, not from anyone. I moved quickly, my hands trembling as I wiped the blood from my knife and shoved it back into my coat pocket. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the courtyard, and I knew I didn't have much time. The door was locked from the inside, they wouldn't be able to enter immediately. But that wouldn't stop them from peering through the broken window pane or forcing their way in if they suspected something was amiss. I crossed the room in 3 quick strides, pushing aside the muslin curtains that covered the window at the back of the room. The glass was cracked but intact enough to shield me from view as I slipped out into the alley beyond. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, sharp and biting against my skin as I crouched low and moved away from Miller's Court as quickly as I could without drawing attention to myself. Whitechapel was alive with movement despite the late hour, figures darting between alleys, drunken voices echoing through narrow streets, and the distant clatter of carts rattling over cobblestones. I kept my head down as I walked, pulling my coat tighter around me to hide any lingering traces of blood that might betray me. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if someone stopped me, if someone recognized me or noticed something unusual about my appearance. But no one did. The city was too consumed by its own misery to notice one more shadow passing through its streets. When I reached my room above the butcher's shop, I wasted no time in destroying everything that could connect me to Miller's Court. My coat was stained with blood, the fabric stiff and sticky where it had soaked through, and I knew it couldn't be salvaged. I threw it into the fireplace along with my gloves, watching as the flames consumed them both and sent thick black smoke curling toward the ceiling. The knife was harder to part with. It had been with me since the beginning, a trusted companion in every kill, but it had served its purpose now. I wrapped it in an old rag and buried it beneath loose floorboards near my bed, hiding it away until I could decide what to do with it permanently. As dawn approached and Whitechapel began to stir once more, I pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing what would be my final letter. "I hope you will be able to show this to all my friends and others," I wrote carefully, my hand steady despite the chaos raging inside me. Jack is gone now. It wasn't just a message, it was a farewell. Jack wasn't untouchable anymore, not after Miller's Court. And if they found him, they would find me. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, its embers glowing faintly as I sat in the darkness, staring at the charred remains of my coat and gloves. The knife was gone now, hidden beneath the floorboards where no one would find it. The room smelled of smoke and ash, a faint reminder of what I had destroyed to protect myself. But it wasn't enough. No matter how much evidence I burned or buried, the fear lingered, the gnawing certainty that someone would find me, that they would connect Jack the Ripper to the quiet man who lived above the butcher's shop. The paranoia was relentless. Every knock on the door, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that passed by my window felt like a threat. I imagined Scotland Yard bursting through my door at any moment, their hands gripping my arms as they dragged me away to face the consequences of what I had done. I wasn't untouchable anymore. The days after Mary Jane Kelly's murder were different from anything I had experienced before. The thrill was gone now, replaced by an emptiness that consumed me from within. Whitechapel was alive with rumors, whispers of Jack's latest atrocity spreading like wildfire through its streets and taverns. The newspapers called it my most brutal kill yet, describing every gruesome detail with a mixture of horror and fascination. But instead of pride, all I felt was dread. They were closer now. I could feel it in the way people looked at me when I passed them on the street, their eyes lingering just a moment too long, as though they suspected something but couldn't quite put their finger on it. Even my neighbors seemed different. Mrs. Cartwright, who lived across the hall, watched me carefully whenever we crossed paths, her gaze sharp with suspicion. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said once, her tone laced with accusation. "Something troubling you?" I forced a smile and shook my head, mumbling some excuse about work before retreating into my room and locking the door behind me. It became clear to me that Jack couldn't survive, not in Whitechapel, not anywhere. The name that had once given me power was now a weight dragging me down into darkness. If they found Jack, they would find me. I began to plan my escape carefully, rehearsing every step in my mind until it felt like second nature. The first step was simple: Jack had to die. The idea came to me late one night as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint sounds of the city outside my window. Montague Drute, a name whispered among Whitechapel's elite as a possible suspect in Jack's reign of terror, had disappeared shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. His body had been found floating in the Thames weeks later, his death ruled a suicide. What if Jack followed Montague's example? What if Jack disappeared into the shadows forever? It wouldn't be difficult, just a few carefully placed clues to suggest that Jack had met his end somewhere far from Whitechapel's streets. A note left behind, perhaps even a body if necessary. And then I could vanish, slip away into anonymity and leave Jack behind like a discarded mask. The letter came first, a final message addressed to Scotland Yard and signed with the name that had become synonymous with terror. "Jack is gone now," I wrote carefully, my hand steady despite the chaos raging inside me. "You will never find him." It wasn't just a message, it was an ending. Jack wasn't untouchable anymore, not after Miller's Court. And if they found him, they would find me. When everything was ready, the letter written, the clues planted, I left Whitechapel behind for good. The streets that had once been mine felt foreign now, hostile and unwelcoming, as though they knew what I had done and wanted me gone. I didn't look back as I walked away from Miller's Court for the last time, disappearing into shadows deeper than guilt, buried beneath memories erased faster than truths spoken, softer than lies told, louder than confessions whispered, quieter beyond redemption denied, longer within eternity awaiting, shorter lives ending faster, moments lasting forever, sins forgiven never, truths confessed, darker lies spoken, softer echoes silencing, louder screams dying, quieter thoughts whispering, clearer confessions written, darker sins forgiven, slower redemption denied, longer eternity awaiting, shorter lives ending faster, moments lasting forever, sins forgiven never, truths confessed, darker lies spoken, softer echoes silencing, louder screams dying, quieter thoughts whispering, clearer confessions whispered, quieter beyond redemption denied, longer. The decision to vanish was inevitable. Jack the Ripper had become too large, too infamous, and too dangerous to sustain. The name that had once given me power now felt like a noose tightening around my neck. The newspapers screamed my deeds in bold headlines, the police patrolled Whitechapel with renewed vigor, even my neighbors whispered about me behind closed doors. I could feel their eyes on me now, watchful, suspicious, waiting for me to slip. And I knew I would. The last letter was different from the others. It wasn't taunting or playful, it was a farewell, a deliberate act of closure meant to sever Jack from myself forever. "I hope you will be able to show this to all my friends and others," I wrote carefully, my hand steady despite the chaos raging inside me. "Jack is gone now." It wasn't just a message, it was an ending. I signed it with the name that had become synonymous with terror, Jack the Ripper. But as I folded the paper and sealed it in an envelope, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of finality that I hadn't felt before. Jack wasn't untouchable anymore, not after Miller's Court. And if they found him, they would find me. The idea of disappearing wasn't new, it had lingered in the back of my mind for weeks, growing louder with each passing day until it drowned out everything else. But how does one erase a name that has become larger than life? How does one kill a ghost? Montague Drute provided the answer. His story was whispered in taverns and alleyways, a man who had been suspected of being Jack but had disappeared shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. His body had been found floating in the Thames weeks later, his death ruled a suicide. What if Jack followed Montague's example? What if Jack vanished into the shadows forever? It wouldn't be difficult, just a few carefully placed clues to suggest that Jack had met his end somewhere far from Whitechapel streets. A note left behind, perhaps even a body if necessary. And then I could disappear, slip away into anonymity and leave Jack behind like a discarded mask. The plan was simple. I would leave Whitechapel for good, abandoning everything that tied me to the name Jack the Ripper. My room above the butcher's shop would be emptied, my belongings burned or buried, my face erased from memory until there was nothing left but whispers and shadows. I imagined what it would feel like to walk away from Miller's Court for the last time, to step into the darkness and let it swallow me whole. Would they miss me? Would they wonder where I had gone? Or would they forget me entirely, replacing Jack with another name, another story, another legend? It didn't matter. What mattered was that I would be free. When everything was ready, the letter written, the clues planted, I left Whitechapel behind for good. The streets that had once been mine felt foreign now, hostile and unwelcoming, as though they knew what I had done and wanted me gone. I didn't look back as I walked away from Miller's Court for the last time, disappearing into shadows deeper than guilt, buried beneath memories erased faster than truths spoken, softer than lies told, louder than confessions whispered, quieter beyond redemption denied, longer within eternity awaiting, shorter lives ending faster, moments lasting forever, sins forgiven never, truths confessed, darker lies spoken, softer echoes silencing, louder screams dying, quieter thoughts whispering, clearer confessions written, darker sins forgiven, slower redemption denied, longer eternity awaiting, shorter lives ending faster, moments lasting forever, sins forgiven never, truths confessed, darker lies spoken, softer echoes silencing, louder screams dying, quieter thoughts whispering, clearer confessions whispered, quieter beyond redemption denied, longer. Years later, they would still speak of Jack in hushed tones, of the man who haunted Whitechapel streets and left behind a trail of blood and mystery. The legend would live on, growing larger with each retelling, until Jack became more than just a name, he became an idea. But I was gone, lost in the shadows, my true identity buried beneath the myth I had created. And in the end, that was all that mattered. When I left London, it wasn't in a rush of panic or desperation. It was calculated, deliberate, and necessary. Whitechapel had become too dangerous, not just because of the police, but because of the myth I had created. Jack the Ripper was no longer a man, he was a legend, a phantom that haunted the streets and minds of everyone in the East End. And legends attract attention, too much attention for someone like me to remain unnoticed. The city itself had turned against me. The once familiar alleys now felt hostile, their shadows no longer comforting but suffocating. The whispers of my neighbors grew louder, their glances sharper, as though they could sense the truth lurking beneath my quiet demeanor. Even the air seemed heavier, thick with suspicion and fear. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots, before someone realized that Jack wasn't just a name scrawled in red ink on paper, but a man who lived among them. So I vanished. The decision to leave wasn't easy. London had been my home for years, its chaos and filth providing the perfect cover for my work. But I couldn't stay, not after Miller's Court, not after Mary Jane Kelly. That night had changed everything. I boarded a ship bound for France under a false name, blending in with the crowds of travelers escaping the cold grip of England's winter. The journey was long and uneventful, the monotonous rhythm of the waves lulling me into a false sense of calm. France was different from London, brighter, cleaner, quieter, but it didn't matter. The hunger followed me across the channel, gnawing at the edges of my mind like a persistent shadow that refused to be cast away. I moved from city to city, never staying in one place for too long. Paris, Lyon, Marseille, each offered its own distractions, its own temptations, but none could silence the voice inside me that whispered of blood and blades and shadows. In time, I settled in Canada, a small town far removed from the bustling streets of London or Paris. It was quiet there, almost too quiet, but it offered something I hadn't felt in years: anonymity. I adopted a new name and a new life, blending in with the townsfolk who were too preoccupied with their own struggles to question where I had come from or why I had chosen their remote corner of the world to call home. I worked as a laborer by day, my hands roughened by hard work that felt foreign after years spent wielding knives with precision and purpose. By night, I kept to myself, retreating to the small cabin I rented on the outskirts of town where no one would hear me if I screamed. But even as I tried to leave Jack behind, pieces of him followed me, small tokens hidden away in a wooden box beneath my bed like relics from another life. There were scraps of fabric stained with blood, locks of hair tied with string, even a small piece of bone that I had taken from one victim as though it were a trophy. Each item carried its own weight, a reminder of what I had done and who I had been, but they also brought comfort in their own way. They were proof that Jack had existed, that he wasn't just a figment of my imagination but something real and tangible that could never be erased completely. Back in London, Jack's legend continued to grow without me. The newspapers printed endless theories about who he was and why he had stopped killing after Mary Jane Kelly. Some claimed he had died or been arrested, others suggested he had fled to America or Australia or some other far-off land where his crimes would go unnoticed. A few even speculated that Jack wasn't a man at all but something more sinister, a demon or ghost sent to punish Whitechapel for its sins. I read these accounts with amusement whenever they reached me, books and pamphlets filled with wild speculation that bore little resemblance to reality. They didn't know me, not really, and that made their attempts to unravel my mystery all the more entertaining. As years turned into decades, Jack became less of a memory and more of an idea, a symbol of fear and chaos that transcended time and place. Modern forensics emerged, fingerprints, DNA analysis, but none could touch me because none knew where to look. I watched from afar as armchair detectives and self-proclaimed experts dissected every detail of my crimes with obsessive fervor. They argued over suspects: Montague Drute, Aaron Kosminski, Carl Feigenbaum, each convinced they had solved the mystery once and for all. But they were wrong. Jack wasn't any one man, he was all men, and no man at all. Years passed, and the world moved on. Whitechapel changed, its streets no longer choked with fog and filth, but bustling with industry and progress. The gaslights were replaced with electric lamps, their glow brighter and steadier than the flickering flames that had once cast shadows over my work. But Jack remained. Even as the city evolved, his name lingered like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away, a ghost haunting London's history, whispered in taverns and classrooms alike. The murders became stories told to frighten children, their details exaggerated and embellished until Jack was no longer a man but a monster. And I watched it all from afar. In Canada, I lived quietly, far removed from the chaos I had left behind in Whitechapel. But Jack's legend followed me even there, carried across oceans by newspapers and books that chronicled his crimes with obsessive detail. I read every word I could find, accounts of the murders, theories about his identity, debates about his motives. Some painted him as a madman driven by rage, others described him as a calculating killer fueled by an insatiable hunger for control. They didn't know me, not really, but their attempts to understand Jack fascinated me nonetheless. One book claimed Jack was a surgeon, a man whose knowledge of anatomy allowed him to mutilate his victims with surgical precision. Another suggested he was an aristocrat who killed for sport, using his wealth and influence to evade capture. The theories grew wilder with each passing year. Jack was a woman disguised as a man. Jack was a member of the royal family. Jack wasn't human at all, but a demon sent to punish Whitechapel for its sins. I laughed at their absurdity, but marveled at their persistence. They wanted so desperately to solve the mystery, to give Jack a face and a name, but they never would. Jack became more than just a killer. He became an idea, a symbol of fear and chaos that transcended time and place. His name was invoked whenever darkness crept into the corners of society, his crimes used as a benchmark for brutality that no one else could match. Others tried to claim his title, copycats who mimicked his methods in hopes of capturing even a fraction of his infamy, but none succeeded. Their kills lacked the artistry, the precision, the purpose that defined Jack's work. They were pale imitations, shadows trying to mimic a ghost. And yet, they added to his legend. Each new murder attributed to Jack only strengthened his legacy, blurring the lines between truth and fiction until even I struggled to separate them. As decades turned into centuries, science advanced in ways I could never have imagined. Fingerprints became standard practice, DNA analysis emerged as the ultimate tool for solving crimes, forensic psychology offered insights into the minds of killers that would have been unthinkable in my time. I watched these developments with fascination and amusement. They thought they could catch me now, solve the mystery that had eluded them for so long, but they didn't realize how far ahead I had been. Jack wasn't careless, he didn't leave clues behind for them to find. The knife was buried beneath floorboards long since destroyed, the blood-stained coat burned in a fire whose ashes had been scattered to the wind. There was nothing left of Jack except his name, and they couldn't trace that. In some ways, Jack's disappearance was his greatest triumph. By vanishing without explanation or trace, he ensured that his story would never truly end, that people would continue searching for answers long after everyone who had known him was gone. Jack wasn't just immortal because of what he had done, he was immortal because of what he hadn't done, because he hadn't been caught or revealed or understood. And as I sat in my small cabin in Canada, reading books filled with wild speculation about who Jack might have been, I felt something close to pride. They didn't know me, not really, and that made their attempts to unravel my mystery all the more entertaining. Beneath my bed lay the wooden box, a relic from another life filled with souvenirs that tied me to Whitechapel even now. Scraps of fabric stained with blood, locks of hair tied with string, even a small piece of bone taken from one victim as though it were a trophy. Each item carried its own weight, a reminder of what I had done and who I had been, but they also brought comfort in their own way. They were proof that Jack had existed, that he wasn't just a figment of imagination but something real and tangible that could never be erased completely. As I grew older and my body began to betray me, my hands trembling where they had once been steady, my mind clouded where it had once been sharp, I wondered if anyone would ever truly know the truth. Would they find me here in Canada? Would they uncover the box beneath my bed? Would they piece together the clues I had left behind? Or would Jack remain forever untouchable, a ghost haunting London's history without ever revealing himself? I didn't know, but part of me hoped they wouldn't. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The myth of Jack the Ripper grew larger than I ever could have imagined. Even as I sat thousands of miles away in my quiet Canadian cabin, his name echoed across the world, whispered in fear, fascination, and speculation. Jack had become more than a man, he was a symbol, a puzzle that no one could solve. I followed the evolution of his story with a mixture of amusement and detachment. The newspapers, the books, the endless theories, they all painted him as something he was not. Some called him a surgeon, others an aristocrat. Some claimed he was a woman or even a member of the royal family. Each theory was more absurd than the last, but they all had one thing in common: they didn't know me. The pretenders amused me most of all, those who tried to claim my name and my legacy for themselves. There were copycat killers who mimicked my methods, hoping to capture even a fraction of the infamy that surrounded Jack. But their work was sloppy, their motives shallow. They didn't understand what it meant to create something lasting, something eternal. Then there were the theorists, armchair detectives, and self-proclaimed experts who dissected every detail of my crimes with obsessive fervor. They argued over suspects with the passion of theologians debating scripture: Montague Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, Walter Sickert. Each name carried its own weight, its own story, but none of them were mine. Aaron Kosminski seemed to be their favorite suspect in recent years, a Polish barber with a history of mental illness who had lived in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. They said his DNA had been found on a shawl near Catherine Eddowes' body, linking him to the scene with what they called unprecedented certainty. I laughed when I read that. DNA? They thought they could solve this with science. They didn't understand how messy Whitechapel had been in 1888, how many hands had touched that shawl, how many lives had brushed against it before and after Catherine's death. Kosminski was convenient, a scapegoat for their frustration, a name they could pin on Jack to give themselves closure. But he wasn't me. The advances in forensic science fascinated me nonetheless. Fingerprints, DNA analysis, forensic psychology, tools that would have been unimaginable in my time now seemed to promise answers to every mystery. I read about these techniques with curiosity, marveling at how far they had come since the days when Scotland Yard relied on witness testimony and gut instincts to solve crimes. But even as I admired their progress, I knew they would never find me, not truly. The knife was gone, the blood-stained coat reduced to ash, the clues erased by time and distance. There was nothing left for them to trace except whispers and shadows. They thought they could catch me now, solve the mystery that had eluded them for so long, but they didn't realize how far ahead I had been. Jack wasn't careless, he didn't leave breadcrumbs for them to follow. He vanished without a trace because he understood something they never would: some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. In my cabin, I kept a small collection of books and articles about Jack, the ones that amused me most or came closest to capturing some fragment of truth. One book claimed Jack was a surgeon, a man whose knowledge of anatomy allowed him to mutilate his victims with surgical precision. Another suggested he was an aristocrat who killed for sport, using his wealth and influence to evade capture. The theories grew wilder with each passing year. Jack was a woman disguised as a man. Jack was an American serial killer hiding among London's poor. Jack wasn't human at all, but some supernatural force sent to punish Whitechapel for its sins. I laughed at their absurdity, but marveled at their persistence. They wanted so desperately to solve the mystery, to give Jack a face and a name, but they never would. Jack's disappearance was his greatest triumph. By vanishing without explanation or trace, he ensured that his story would never truly end, that people would continue searching for answers long after everyone who had known him was gone. Jack wasn't just immortal because of what he had done, he was immortal because of what he hadn't done, because he hadn't been caught or revealed or understood. And as I sat in my small cabin in Canada, reading books filled with wild speculation about who Jack might have been, I felt something close to pride. They didn't know me, not really, and that made their attempts to unravel my mystery all the more entertaining. As the years stretched into decades, I became a man of two worlds. In one, I was a quiet laborer living in a small Canadian town, blending into the fabric of society with practiced ease. In the other, I was Jack the Ripper, a name that had transcended time and place, evolving into something far greater than the man who had first wielded the knife in Whitechapel's shadows. The myth grew without me, fueled by speculation and obsession. Jack became a puzzle that no one could solve, a ghost haunting London's history. And as I watched from afar, I couldn't help but marvel at how little they truly understood. The fascination with Jack never waned. Even now, more than a century after the murders, his name still commands attention. Historians and forensic scientists pore over every scrap of evidence, every rumor and theory, hoping to uncover the truth. I followed their efforts with interest, reading articles and books that dissected my crimes with obsessive detail. They analyzed the letters I had written, the "Dear Boss" letter that gave Jack his name, the "From Hell" letter that came with half a kidney, and debated whether they were genuine or clever hoaxes crafted by journalists to sell papers. They studied the crime scenes, scrutinizing every cut and mutilation for clues about my identity and motives. Some argued that I was a surgeon, others claimed I was a butcher or barber with anatomical knowledge. A few even suggested I was insane, driven by uncontrollable rage or delusions. But none of them understood me, not really. They saw only fragments of Jack's story, piecing them together like shards of broken glass in an attempt to form something whole. The advances in forensic science fascinated me most of all. DNA analysis emerged as the ultimate tool for solving mysteries, promising answers to questions that had remained unanswered for centuries. In recent years, they claimed to have found my DNA, traces of mitochondrial DNA on Catherine Eddowes' shawl that matched Aaron Kosminski, one of their favorite suspects, 124. The evidence was published in peer-reviewed journals and hailed as the most systematic genetic analysis to date. Kosminski fit their narrative well, a Polish barber with brown hair and brown eyes who lived in Whitechapel during the murders. 24. But even as they celebrated their discovery, doubts lingered. Critics argued that mitochondrial DNA was better suited for excluding suspects than identifying them. 14. Others questioned whether the shawl had truly belonged to Eddowes or whether it had been contaminated over time. 1. I read these accounts with amusement. They thought they were close now, that science would finally reveal Jack's identity, but they didn't realize how far ahead I had been. The knife was gone, the blood-stained coat reduced to ash, the clues erased by time and distance. There was nothing left for them to trace except whispers and shadows. What amused me most were the pretenders, those who claimed my name and legacy as their own. Copycat killers mimicked my methods, hoping to capture even a fraction of Jack's infamy. Their work was sloppy and uninspired, pale imitations of what I had created in Whitechapel's alleys. Then there were those who claimed to have solved the mystery entirely: Montague Druitt, Walter Sickert, Carl Feigenbaum. Each name carried its own weight, its own story, but none of them were mine. Montague Druitt intrigued me most, a man whose suicide shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder led many to believe he was Jack. His body found floating in the Thames seemed poetic somehow, a fitting end for someone who could never have been me. Jack's disappearance was his greatest triumph. By vanishing without explanation or trace, he ensured that his story would never truly end, that people would continue searching for answers long after everyone who had known him was gone. Jack wasn't just immortal because of what he had done, he was immortal because of what he hadn't done, because he hadn't been caught or revealed or understood. And as I sat in my small cabin in Canada, reading books filled with wild speculation about who Jack might have been, I felt something close to pride. They didn't know me, not really, and that made their attempts to unravel my mystery all the more entertaining. Beneath my bed lay the wooden box, a relic from another life filled with souvenirs that tied me to Whitechapel even now. Scraps of fabric stained with blood, locks of hair tied with string, even a small piece of bone taken from one victim as though it were a trophy. Each item carried its own weight, a reminder of what I had done and who I had been, but they also brought comfort in their own way. They were proof that Jack had existed, that he wasn't just a figment of imagination, but something real and tangible that could never be erased completely. As my body began to betray me, my hands trembling where they had once been steady, my mind clouded where it had once been sharp. I wondered if anyone would ever truly know the truth. Would they find me here in Canada? Would they uncover the box beneath my bed? Would they piece together the clues I had left behind? Or would Jack remain forever untouchable, a ghost haunting London's history without ever revealing himself? I didn't know, but part of me hoped they wouldn't. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. I never stopped watching. The world moved on without me, but I remained, hidden in shadows, forgotten by time yet tethered to it by the name Jack the Ripper. Whitechapel changed first. The gaslights that once flickered over its cobblestones were replaced by electric lamps that cast steady light across streets scrubbed clean of filth and blood. The alleys where I once hunted became unrecognizable, wider, brighter, safer. But monsters like me, we don't die. We wait. I watched as London grew into something new, its skyline pierced by towers of steel and glass instead of chimneys belching smoke into the foggy air. The horses that once pulled carts through its streets vanished, replaced by automobiles that roared like beasts of metal and fire. The people changed too, more hurried now, their faces lit by screens instead of candles or lamplight. They no longer whispered about Jack in fear, they spoke of him in fascination, dissecting his story with clinical precision as though he were nothing more than a puzzle to be solved or a character in some macabre play. Jack was never meant to last this long, not as a name or an idea. When I disappeared from Whitechapel after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, I thought I had buried him forever. But instead of fading into obscurity, Jack grew larger than life, a ghost haunting London's history and beyond. They called him many things over the years, a butcher, a surgeon, an aristocrat, a madman driven by rage or an artist fueled by obsession, a demon sent to punish Whitechapel for its sins or a victim of society's cruelty turned predator. But none of them understood him, not truly, because none of them understood me. Jack wasn't just a killer, he was a mirror reflecting everything they feared about themselves, the darkness lurking beneath their civilized facades. And that's why he endured. I lived quietly after Whitechapel, a shadow among shadows in towns far removed from London's chaos. Canada was kind to me at first, its vast wilderness offered solitude that felt almost cleansing after years spent navigating Whitechapel's labyrinthine alleys. But solitude has its price. As decades passed and my body began to betray me, my hands trembling where they had once been steady, my mind clouded where it had once been sharp, I found myself haunted not just by Jack but by the man who had created him. Who was I now? A relic from another time? A ghost clinging to memories that no longer mattered? Or was I still Jack, immortalized not through flesh but through fear? The books fascinated me most, the endless theories about who Jack might have been and why he had stopped killing after Mary Jane Kelly. Some claimed he had died or been arrested, others suggested he had fled to America or Australia or some other far-off land where his crimes would go unnoticed. A few even speculated that Jack wasn't human at all, that he was something darker and more eternal than any man could ever be. I read these accounts with amusement whenever they reached me, books filled with wild speculation that bore little resemblance to reality but captured something essential nonetheless. Jack wasn't just a name, he was an idea. And ideas don't die, they evolve. As my body grew weaker and my mind more fragmented, I began to wonder if it was time to let go, to leave behind the truth for someone else to find when I was gone. Would they understand? Would they believe? Or would Jack remain untouchable, a ghost haunting London's history without ever revealing himself? I didn't know, but part of me hoped they wouldn't. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The decision to write it came slowly, like a shadow creeping across the walls of my mind. For decades, I had lived with the weight of Jack's name, his legacy, and the myth that had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined. I had watched from afar as they dissected his crimes, debated his identity, and turned him into something larger than life. But now, as my body betrayed me and my days grew shorter, the thought of leaving behind the truth became irresistible. Not for fame or recognition, those things had long ceased to matter, but for closure. For myself. For Jack. I sat at my desk in the small cabin I had called home for years, staring at the blank sheet of paper before me. The pen felt heavy in my hand, its weight unfamiliar after so many years spent avoiding words and clinging to silence. What would I say? How could I explain what I had done, what Jack had done, without sounding like a madman or a liar? The first words came haltingly, each one dragging itself onto the page as though reluctant to be written. I am Jack the Ripper. I paused, letting the ink dry as I stared at the sentence before me. It felt surreal to see those words in my own handwriting, to acknowledge what I had been and what I had done after so many years spent hiding from it. But there was no turning back now. I wrote slowly, methodically, recounting each kill with a precision that mirrored the acts themselves. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, their names flowed onto the page like blood spilling onto cobblestones. I described their final moments in vivid detail, the way their bodies had looked beneath the flickering gaslights, the sound of their screams cut short by my blade, the satisfaction that came with each cut and incision. But it wasn't just about the murders, it was about Jack himself, the man behind the name and the myth. Jack wasn't born in Whitechapel, I wrote carefully, my hand steady despite the tremors that had begun to plague me in recent years. He was born long before that, in shadows and silence, in anger and hunger that could never be satisfied. As I wrote, I found myself questioning why I was doing this, why I was revealing a truth that no one had asked for and that no one might believe. Was it guilt? Regret? A desire for redemption? No, it wasn't any of those things. Jack didn't feel guilt, he didn't regret what he had done or seek forgiveness for his sins. He was beyond such human frailties. But there was something else, a need to be understood. Not by everyone, not by historians or detectives or armchair theorists who would pore over my words with skepticism and doubt. By someone, anyone, who might read my confession and see Jack for what he truly was, not a monster but a mirror reflecting everything they feared about themselves. The confession grew longer with each passing day, filling pages with words that felt both foreign and familiar. It became more than just an account of Jack's crimes, it became a reflection on life itself, on humanity's capacity for darkness and its endless fascination with fear. Monsters like me don't die, I wrote near the end of one page, my pen scratching against paper like a knife cutting through flesh. We wait, in shadows and silence, for someone to find us. When the confession was finished, I folded it carefully and placed it inside a wooden box beneath my bed, the same box where I kept souvenirs from Whitechapel, scraps of fabric stained with blood, locks of hair tied with string, even a small piece of bone taken from one victim as though it were a trophy. It felt fitting somehow, that Jack's truth should rest alongside his relics until someone found them both. But as I closed the box and slid it back beneath my bed, doubt crept into my mind. Would anyone believe me? Would they dismiss my confession as nothing more than another theory, a hoax crafted by someone seeking attention? Or would they finally understand? I left the confession unsigned, not because I feared discovery, but because Jack didn't need a name anymore. He wasn't just John Davis or Montague Drute or Aaron Kosminski or any other suspect they might have named over the years. He was all men, and no man at all. Jack wasn't just a killer, he was an idea. And ideas don't die, they evolve. I have lived long enough to see the world change in ways I could never have imagined. The streets of Whitechapel, once shrouded in fog and filth, are now bustling with tourists retracing my steps, searching for answers that will never come. My name has become a commodity, a story told in books, films, and documentaries. Jack the Ripper, the faceless killer who haunted London's darkest corners, endures as a myth, a puzzle, a ghost. But I am no ghost. I am flesh and blood. I am the man who walked those streets, who wielded the knife, who wrote those letters. And now, as my body grows weaker and my days grow shorter, I find myself reflecting on what it all means, not just for me but for the world I leave behind. Monsters like me don't die. Not really. We wait, in shadows and silence, for someone to find us, to give us shape and meaning. Jack has waited for over a century now, his name whispered in fear and fascination by those who think they understand him but never will. Death is inevitable for men like me, but obscurity is not. Jack will live on long after my body is gone, his name etched into history as a symbol of chaos and fear. And that is the greatest irony of all. Jack was born from obscurity, from the hunger of a man who wanted to be seen, to be known. Now he is eternal. I have written it all down, the truth of what happened in Whitechapel during those nights of terror. The murders, the letters, the reasons why Jack existed in the first place, it's all there, waiting to be found after I am gone. But I have left it unsigned. Not because I fear discovery, but because Jack doesn't need a name anymore. He is more than just John Davis or Montague Drute or Aaron Kosminski or any other suspect they might have named over the years. Jack isn't just a killer, he is an idea, a reflection of everything humanity fears about itself. As I sit here in my quiet cabin, staring at the box beneath my bed that holds both my confession and the relics of my crimes, I find myself wondering if anyone will ever truly understand what Jack represents. He isn't just a man, he is a mirror, a reminder that darkness exists not just in alleys and shadows, but in every heart and mind. We all have our monsters lurking within us, whispering temptations we dare not voice aloud, urging us toward acts we cannot imagine ourselves capable of committing. Jack simply gave his monster shape, a knife in hand and blood on cobblestones, and let it loose upon the world. When they find my confession, and they will, it will raise more questions than it answers. Some will call it a hoax, others will claim it as proof that Jack has finally been unmasked. But none will know for certain. The truth is this: Jack was never meant to be understood. He was meant to haunt, to linger in shadows where answers cannot reach him. And so he will remain, untouchable,